Where'd your mother run off to, boy? Huh? Or did she finally drop dead?
Caleb Sutton's dented saxophone case dangled from his hand, ripped from the boy's arms seconds earlier.
Ghetto trash.
Sir, give it back.
Make me.
40 students watched. Phones came up. Nobody moved. "Try me," Whitaker said.
Try me.
"I dare you." Caleb looked
I dare
up,
you.
calm, unreadable. What happened in the next 11 minutes would end a principal's 20-year career, make a senator cancel her speech, and leave 40 million strangers crying over a boy they'd never meet. And it started with one note. To understand what Caleb Sutton did in that atrium, you have to understand the mornings. Long before Jefferson Prep, long before the gala, long before Harold Whitaker ever learned his name. 4:30 in the morning, in a third-floor walk-up on the edge of Roxbury. The radiator hissed like a tired animal. Through the thin walls came the sound of Mrs. Delgado getting home from her night shift at Boston Medical. Keys in the door, shoes off, the soft groan of a woman who had been on her feet for 12 hours. Below that, the faint smell of pine sol drifting up the stairwell, and fried plantains from the apartment downstairs where a Haitian family cooked breakfast before dawn. Caleb was already awake. He was always already awake. He moved through the dark apartment in socks, careful of the spot in the hallway where the floorboard creaked. Past the living room where his grandmother slept on the pull-out sofa because she said her hip wouldn't climb the stairs anymore. Past the framed photograph on the wall, a young woman with Caleb's exact smile, her head thrown back in laughter, a hospital bracelet still on her wrist. His mother, dead from lupus at 29. Caleb had been 9 years old. His father he had never met. He didn't ask anymore. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and stood at the window. The street lights on Blue Hill Avenue threw orange rectangles across the counter. Somewhere a siren, somewhere a dog. The city breathing in its sleep. Dolores Sutton's voice came from the dark living room, soft and scratched from decades behind the wheel of a city bus. "You eatin' before you go, baby?" "I'll get something at school, Grandma." "You say that every day, and I know it ain't true." He smiled. He hadn't known she was awake. She always was. "Go back to sleep." "Caleb." "Yeah?" "Don't shrink for nobody today. Your music is your ancestors talking. You hear me?" "I hear you." He said it the way he'd said it every morning for 3 years. He didn't know yet that this was the morning the world flipped. On the kitchen table sat a manila envelope from Boston Medical Center. Stage 2 congestive heart failure. Dolores had been diagnosed 6 weeks ago. She had refused to tell him for 4 of those weeks, and when he'd finally found the letter, she'd just shrugged and said the Lord would sort it out. The medical bills underneath it, 3 of them now, she hadn't bothered to open at all. Caleb looked at the envelopes for a long moment. Then he picked up his saxophone case, zipped his jacket, and slipped out into the cold. It was a scratched-up Selmer Alto. The bell had a dent where a previous owner had dropped it. The lacquer was worn through in patches. 2 winters ago, Dolores had walked into the pawn shop on Blue Hill Avenue and come out with it wrapped in a bedsheet, $300 lighter. She had sold her wedding ring that afternoon. She had been married to Caleb's grandfather for 31 years before a heart attack took him in 2014. She never once told Caleb what she had done, but he had found the receipt in a shoebox 6 months later and never mentioned it. He caught the 28 bus at 4:52, then the Orange Line at Ruggles, then the 39 out to Jamaica Plain, and a 10-minute walk through streets lined with homes that cost more than his entire building. Jefferson Preparatory Academy rose up out of the dark at the end of a long drive, lit like a cathedral. Brick and ivy and 2 centuries of old Boston money. Tuition $64,000 a year. Oil portraits of dead headmasters in every hallway. 20 scholarship students out of a student body of 600, and Caleb was one of them. He let himself in through the side entrance the music faculty used. The building was empty. It was 5:40 in the morning. In the music room, the morning light hadn't come yet. He unpacked the Selmer in the dark, wet the reed, warmed the keys in his palms. He could not practice at home. The walls were too thin. Mrs. Delgado deserved her sleep. His grandmother deserved her quiet. So every morning for 3 years he came here, to this empty room, and played. That was where Mrs. Evelyn Brooks first heard him. 63 years old, black, former Juilliard. She had taught music at Jefferson Prep for 21 years and had seen every kind of prodigy the East Coast could produce. She had heard kids who could read any score, kids whose parents paid for $2,000 private lessons, kids who practiced Mozart until their fingers bled. She had never heard anything like Caleb Sutton. She had come in early one morning in September to grade papers. She had heard the saxophone through the door and had stopped with her hand on the knob. He was playing A Love Supreme. Not the sheet music, the Coltrane recording from memory, note for note, every bend and cry and hesitation. He was 16 years old and he had never had a single private lesson in his life. Mrs. Brooks had stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth. Then she had very quietly closed the door so nobody would interrupt him, and she had walked to her office and sat down and whispered to the empty room, "Lord, that boy's got it." She told him that afternoon that she wanted him to audition for Berklee College of Music. She told him that 6 weeks from the gala, he had an audition slot, full scholarship consideration, the best jazz program in the country. She told him he would need a recommendation letter from the principal to complete his application. Harold Whitaker had held that letter on his desk, unsigned, for 3 weeks. And still, every morning, Caleb came. 4:30, the bus, the train, the empty music room, the scratched Selmer, the reed against his lip, his grandmother's voice in his head. Don't shrink for nobody. That week, Dolores had fallen twice. Her lips had gone blue on the second one. The doctor had used the phrase palliative planning, and she had waved him off and asked if she could still cook Sunday breakfast. The medical bills on the kitchen table had climbed to 4. The envelope from Berklee sat next to them, unopened, because Caleb was afraid to look at it until he had the letter from Whitaker in his hand. So when Dolores zipped his jacket that Friday morning, 2 hours before he would walk into the Jefferson Prep atrium and meet Harold Whitaker for the last time, she reached up and cupped his face. Her hands were cold, her eyes were not. "Your music is your ancestors talking, baby. Let them talk." He kissed her forehead. Then he walked out into the dark, carrying a saxophone his grandmother had bought with her wedding ring, toward a school that had been waiting 3 years to break him. "You are going to want to be here when this boy stops being quiet." Harold Whitaker did not arrive at Jefferson Prep the way his students did. He arrived the way a man arrives who has never, in 58 years, walked into a room he did not already own. His forest green Range Rover pulled into the reserved space at the front of the faculty lot at 7:15 every morning. He took the same 3 steps up to the main entrance, nodded at the same groundskeeper, and walked the same path to his office, where his assistant had already laid out the morning's correspondence and a black coffee at exactly the temperature he preferred. The assistant's name was Claire Donovan. She had worked for him for 9 years. She had learned in the first month that Harold Whitaker did not repeat himself, and that the worst thing you could do in his presence was ask him to. He wore Brooks Brothers. His cufflinks had belonged to his grandfather, Edmund Whitaker, whose oil portrait hung in the Jefferson Prep library above a brass plaque that read, Headmaster, 1958 to 1974. His own father had served on the board of trustees for 22 years. Harold had taken the principalship not for money. He had married into the Kensington family, one of the oldest Brahmin names in Boston, and money was not a thing he thought about, but for legacy. He used that word often, legacy. It fell out of his mouth the way some men said the weather. He walked the halls with 2 assistant deans flanking him a half step behind. Students stepped aside without being asked. When he wanted something, he snapped his fingers once, sharply. Staff moved. He smiled with his mouth and never with his eyes. And if you worked at Jefferson Prep long enough, you learned to read the difference between a Whitaker smile that meant approval and a Whitaker smile that meant your contract would not be renewed. 3 weeks before the gala, he had lost a vote. It had happened in the mahogany-paneled boardroom on the 3rd floor, with 11 other trustees around a table older than the United States. He had dressed carefully that morning. He had prepared his remarks. He had not raised his voice once. He had proposed that the Jefferson Scholarship Program, the one that brought 12 minority students into the academy each year on full tuition, be restructured. He had not used the word cut. He had used phrases like academic integrity and institutional standards, and preserving what makes Jefferson, Jefferson. He had pointed out with his hands folded neatly on the table that certain scholarship students had struggled to integrate into the school's culture. The vote was 8-5, against him. He had not shown anger in the room. He had thanked the trustees for their time. He had walked back to his office, closed the door, and sat at his desk for 40 minutes without moving. When Claire had come in with his afternoon schedule, she had seen his face, set down the folder, and left without speaking. After that day, Caleb Sutton became a problem. It was nothing you could file a complaint about. That was the art of it. It was a locker search, chosen at random, 3 times in 1 month. It was a comment in the cafeteria, loud enough for 2 tables to hear, about the way Caleb said ain't when he was joking with friends. It was an offhand instruction to the dining hall staff that scholarship students really ought to eat at the side tables, to preserve, as he put it, the historical seating chart of the hall. It was Mrs. Brooks submitting Caleb's paperwork for the Massachusetts All-State Jazz Competition, and the paperwork never reaching the state office. It was her resubmitting it, and the second copy vanishing from Whitaker's outbox too. It was the recommendation letter for Berkeley sitting on his desk, 3 weeks old, unsigned, while Caleb quietly asked Mrs. Brooks every Friday if there was any news, and she quietly said, "Not yet, baby, not yet." Harold Whitaker did not hate Caleb Sutton. Hate would have required seeing him as a person. What Harold felt was closer to irritation. The way a man feels about a smudge on his window, something to be wiped away before the guests arrived. And the guests were arriving. The Founders Gala was the most important night of his calendar year. $1,500 a plate. Senator Elaine Whitmore as the keynote. 3 local news crews. A string quartet he had personally vetted from the New England Conservatory. Every major donor in the Jefferson Prep Alumni Network walking through his front doors by 7 o'clock Friday evening. On Thursday afternoon, Claire brought him the final guest list for approval. He scanned it, initialed the bottom, and handed it back without looking up. "No surprises, Claire. Not this year." Claire said, "Of course, sir," and closed the door behind her. 22 hours later, Harold Whitaker would snap his fingers in a marble atrium in front of 40 students and ruin the rest of his life in the space of 11 minutes. Friday afternoon, 3:42. The last bell had rung 12 minutes earlier, and the main atrium of Jefferson Preparatory Academy had filled the way it always filled on Fridays. Slow, loud, students in no hurry to leave. The atrium was the showpiece of the building. Italian marble floors, walls of cream-colored stone, a vaulted glass skylight 20 feet overhead that caught the afternoon sun and threw it down in long gold columns. The acoustics were famous. A whisper in one corner could be heard clearly at the other end. A single footstep echoed for 2 full seconds. No instruments stood in the space, just the architecture, just the air. Caleb was crossing it the way he crossed it every Friday, saxophone case in his right hand, backpack on his left shoulder. Mrs. Brooks had asked him to bring the Selmer to her office before he left for the weekend. She wanted to adjust the neck strap, nothing more than that. He was 10 steps from the east corridor when he heard the voice behind him. "Mr. Sutton!" Caleb stopped. 40 students in the atrium stopped with him. The sound of footsteps and conversation dropped by half, then by 3/4. Somewhere near the main staircase, a phone came up, then another, then 4 more. Caleb turned around. Harold Whitaker stood in the center of the marble floor, 2 assistant deans a half step behind him. He had come down from the 3rd floor. He had been watching from the mezzanine. He had chosen his moment. "What," he said, "is that doing out of storage?" Caleb's voice was steady, respectful. "Just moving it, sir. Mrs. Brooks asked me to bring it to her office." Mrs. Brooks doesn't run this gala. I do. Caleb said nothing. Whitaker closed the distance. 10 feet. 6. 3. The assistant deans stayed where they were. A visiting parent on the far side of the atrium, a woman in a red coat who had been picking up her daughter for an orthodontist appointment, took her phone out of her purse and pressed record without lifting it. "You think that dented thing in your hand is an instrument?" The first phones in the crowd tilted up. "You think that belongs on a Jefferson stage?" A freshman near the staircase said softly, "Oh my God." Whitaker heard it. His mouth curved. He turned his body slightly so the students could see his face, so he was no longer speaking to Caleb but performing through him. "Mrs. Brooks tells me you're a prodigy. She uses that word. Prodigy. I've heard it in her emails for 2 years now." He let the silence hang. "Let's find out." Somewhere on the second-floor balcony, a teacher appeared. A younger man, new this year, and froze at the railing, uncertain whether to intervene. "Take it out," Whitaker said. "Right here, right now, in front of every person standing in this atrium. Let me hear this prodigy for myself." Caleb's jaw tightened by a millimeter. Nothing else moved. "Try. I dare you." He let those 4 words sit in the air. He had chosen them. He had known, walking down those stairs, that he was going to say them. "And if what I hear isn't what Mrs. Brooks has been promising me, then you walk into my office before the gala starts tonight and you put your scholarship badge on my desk. We'll call it a mutual agreement. No hard feelings." The atrium had gone completely still. Mrs. Brooks appeared in the east corridor, 2 steps into the space, and stopped. Her hand went to her chest. Her face had gone the color of paper. "Harold," she said, "this is inappropriate. This is—" "Evelyn, let the boy speak for himself." He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at Caleb. Caleb was looking at the saxophone case in his hand. He was thinking about Dolores in the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning. He was thinking about the pawn shop receipt in the shoebox under her bed. He was thinking about the envelope from Berkeley that had been sitting unopened on the kitchen table for 12 days because he had been afraid to see inside until he had the letter from this man's desk. He was thinking that if he played and anything went wrong, a cracked reed, a slipped note, a second of doubt, there would be a video of it on the internet by bedtime. And every story that had ever been written about the scholarship kid who couldn't cut it would write itself around his face. And he was thinking that if he walked away, something inside him would die that he would spend the rest of his life trying to bring back. Okay, real talk. I had to stop writing this part 3 times. A grown man with a Harvard degree cornering a 17-year-old kid in front of his classmates to settle a grudge he caught in a boardroom? Nah, fam, that's not discipline. That's ego in a blazer. Caleb set the saxophone case down on the marble floor. The click of the first latch rang across the atrium like a dropped coin. The second latch clicked a beat later. Somebody in the crowd flinched at the sound. That was how quiet the room had gotten. He didn't open the case yet. He closed his eyes. 2 seconds, maybe 3, long enough for Whitaker to shift his weight from one foot to the other, not understanding what this pause was. Behind Caleb's closed eyes, his grandmother was standing in the kitchen in a housecoat, pouring coffee she wasn't supposed to drink anymore. Behind her, his mother, 28 years old in a hospital gown, humming "Someday My Prince Will Come" through an oxygen mask because she said silence scared her worse than pain. Behind her, a pawn shop counter on Blue Hill Avenue, a wedding ring in a velvet tray, a receipt in a shoebox he was never supposed to find. Behind all of that, Coltrane at 3 in the morning on a vinyl record older than he was, playing through the kitchen speaker while his grandmother swayed at the stove. He could walk away. He could hand the case to Mrs. Brooks, pick up his backpack, and be on a bus back to Roxbury in 20 minutes. He would lose the scholarship. He would lose Berkeley. His grandmother would die in a walk-up with unopened bills on the kitchen table, and he would spend 40 years wondering who he might have been. He could play, and if one note cracked, the video would outlive him. Mrs. Brooks took another step forward. Her voice was small. "Harold, please." Whitaker didn't look at her. "Let the boy speak for himself, Evelyn." Caleb opened his eyes. "All right," he said. His voice was quiet. The atrium was quiet enough to hold it. "Listen close." He bent down and opened the case. The Selmer came out in his hands the way a thing comes out that has been held 1,000 times in the dark. He slipped the neck strap over his head. He wet the reed. He set the mouthpiece. He did it slowly, the way Mrs. Brooks had taught him, because she had told him a long time ago that how you pick up your instrument is how you pick up your whole life. Then he did something Harold Whitaker had not expected. He walked past him, not around him, past him, close enough that Whitaker had to shift his shoulder back an inch. Caleb kept walking into the center of the atrium and stopped directly beneath the glass skylight, where the marble caught the sound and sent it straight up. He lifted the saxophone to his lips. For the first time in 3 years at Jefferson Prep, Caleb Sutton was not asking for permission. The first note was low, a single long B-flat, held for the count of 4, soft enough that the students at the back of the atrium leaned forward without realizing they had moved. It hummed against the marble. It climbed the walls. It found the glass of the skylight and sat there, waiting. Caleb didn't open his eyes. The second note came after a breath, then a third. He was not in a hurry. He had spent 3 years practicing in an empty music room at 5:40 in the morning, and he had learned, somewhere in all those mornings, that the first 30 seconds of any piece was not about playing. It was about telling the room it was safe to listen. He slid into the opening phrase of Body and Soul, the Coleman Hawkins Standard, 1939, the one his grandmother used to put on the record player on Sunday mornings while she fried bacon in a cast-iron pan and sang along, off-key, happy. She had told him once, when he was 12, that every black musician in America had to know Body and Soul, the way every Christian had to know the Lord's Prayer. You didn't choose it. It was given to you. You carried it. He played it the way Hawkins played it, slow, warm, deliberate. The melody unfolded out of the saxophone like someone unfolding a letter they had been carrying in a coat pocket for years. In the crowd, a freshman named Megan Howell lowered her phone. She had been recording. She stopped. She wanted to hear it with her ears, not through a screen. A boy beside her glanced over, saw her face, and lowered his own phone a second later. On the mezzanine, the young teacher who had frozen at the railing gripped it now with both hands. Harold Whitaker stood exactly where he had been standing. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set. He was waiting for the mistake. He was certain it was coming. Every kid he had ever watched perform under pressure cracked in the first 60 seconds, and he was counting. 60 seconds passed. Caleb did not crack. He finished the first chorus of Body and Soul the way it was written, and then he did something the written arrangement did not call for. He modulated, not up, down, into a lower key, darker, the way a storyteller drops his voice when the story is about to turn. Mrs. Brooks, standing in the east corridor, made a small sound in her throat. She recognized the modulation. She had heard fragments of it before, drifting out of the music room at 6 in the morning when she'd come in early to grade papers. She had never heard the whole piece. Nobody had. Caleb had been writing it for 7 months at 5:40 a.m. alone, and he had never played it for another human being in his life. He played it now. The melody that came out of the Selmer was not a standard. It was not a cover. It was his. It started in the low register, mournful, almost conversational, the way his grandmother talked to herself when she thought he was asleep. Then it climbed. Not fast. Patient. Step by step, a half tone at a time, the way a child climbs a staircase that is a little too tall for him. Halfway up, it paused. It hung on a single note, a high A. It held it. It held it. Then it broke, cleanly, deliberately, into a run of 16th notes so fast and so clean that a senior in the back of the atrium, a boy named Trevor Klein, who played second chair in the Jefferson Prep Jazz Band, whispered out loud, "That's not possible." The custodian who had been pushing a broom near the west wall stopped. He set the broom against the wall. He did not pick it up again for 11 minutes. The visiting parent in the red coat was crying. Her phone was still recording, held at waist level, forgotten. On the second floor, 3 more teachers had gathered at the railing. The head of the English department put her hand over her mouth. The chemistry teacher, a man in his 60s who had been at Jefferson Prep for 28 years and was famously hard to impress, said quietly to no one, "Who taught this boy?" Nobody had taught him, that was the answer. Mrs. Brooks had guided him. She had handed him sheet music and recordings and said, "Listen to this, listen to this, now listen to this." She had never given him a private lesson in her life. He had taught himself in an empty room at an hour when the rest of the school was still asleep. Somewhere in the back of the atrium, a side door opened. A woman stepped through, mid-40s, gray pantsuit, an earpiece in her left ear, a clipboard in her hand. Her name was Diane Kessler, and she was the advanced logistics coordinator for Senator Elaine Whitmore's office, and she had come to the school an hour early to walk the room for the gala security sweep. She took 2 steps into the atrium. She stopped. She listened for 20 seconds. Then she lifted her wrist to her mouth and spoke into the cuff of her jacket, and whatever she said made the voice on the other end say, "Stand by," and go silent. Caleb did not see her. Caleb did not see anyone. He had forgotten Harold Whitaker existed. The improvisation climbed into its second movement, and here the piece changed again. It got wider. It got older. The bluesy cry of the alto saxophone shifted into something hymn-like, something that belonged in a small wooden church on a hot Sunday morning. His grandmother's church, Mount Zion Baptist on Warren Street, where she had sung in the choir for 41 years, and where Caleb had spent every Sunday of his childhood watching old women in white hats sway in time and shout, "Yes, Lord," when the Spirit moved them. He played that now. Not a hymn anyone would recognize, just the feeling of one, the bend of the notes, the call and the response, the way gospel music reached up and pulled heaven down by the collar. A woman in the crowd, a cafeteria worker named Rosa Jimenez, who had clocked out 10 minutes earlier and had stayed to see what the noise was, crossed herself. Then Caleb did the thing that broke the room in half. He quoted Coltrane, 4 notes, just 4. The opening phrase of A Love Supreme, the most sacred 4 notes in American jazz. The phrase Coltrane had written on his knees after surviving heroin addiction. The phrase he had said came to him directly from God. Trevor Klein, the second-chair jazz band senior, put both hands on top of his head and said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "No way! No way!" Mrs. Brooks had both hands pressed to her chest. Tears were running down her face, and she was not wiping them away. Harold Whitaker's arms had uncrossed. He did not remember uncrossing them. They hung at his sides. His mouth was slightly open. The assistant deans behind him had taken a half step away without knowing they had done it, the way people instinctively step away from a man who is about to fall. A boy named Brendan Walsh, a junior, 6'3", the captain of the lacrosse team, who 2 months earlier had shoved Caleb into a locker in the gym hallway and called him a name Caleb had never told his grandmother about, was crying. Openly. Not wiping his face. His shoulders were shaking. The saxophone isn't an instrument anymore. That was what the chemistry teacher would tell a reporter 4 days later when the video had 40 million views and news crews were standing on the lawn of Jefferson Prep at 6 in the morning. It wasn't an instrument. It was a testimony. That boy was telling us something we hadn't earned the right to hear. The third movement began, and the third movement soared. It was everything the first 2 had been building toward. It took the low conversation of the opening and the mournful climb of the middle and the gospel cry of the second movement, and it lifted them all at once. The melody rose through the octaves. It found the high register of the alto saxophone, and it stayed there, clean, unbroken, without a single crack or hesitation, for 16 straight bars. Diane Kessler, in the back of the atrium, was crying. She had worked for the senator for 11 years. She had stood next to the caskets of soldiers. She had watched the senator speak at the funerals of children. She did not cry at work. She was crying now. Caleb held a note, a high G, clear, the cleanest note anyone in that atrium had ever heard come out of a saxophone in their lives. He held it. He held it. The crowd had stopped breathing, literally stopped. 3 doctors watching the video later would point to the exact moment in the recording where 40 people collectively held their breath for 9 seconds. He held it. Then, instead of cutting it, instead of ending it, instead of punching it the way a lesser musician would have punched it for the applause, he let it fade. He let the air leave the reed slowly. He let the note thin into nothing. He let it die into the marble the way the last light of evening dies out of a window. The note disappeared. He lowered the saxophone. Nobody applauded. Nobody moved. The atrium was completely, absolutely silent. No breath, no shuffle, no cough. The glass skylight overhead caught a line of afternoon sun and threw it across the floor in a long gold stripe. And inside that stripe of light stood a 17-year-old boy in a thrift store jacket, holding a dented Selmer Alto against his thigh, looking at nothing. 1 second passed. 2. 3. 4. Somewhere in the crowd, someone exhaled. A broken, half-swallowed sound, the noise a person makes when they have been holding a sob in their chest and cannot hold it anymore. And then the atrium detonated. It was not applause. Applause was too small a word. It was 40 students and 6 teachers and 1 custodian and 1 cafeteria worker and 1 visiting parent in a red coat. And it came out of them all at once, and it did not stop. Students climbed onto the benches along the wall. A girl in the front row was screaming. Not words, just sound. The pure noise of a human being who had just watched something she would tell her grandchildren about. The young teacher on the mezzanine was pounding the railing with the flat of his hand. The chemistry teacher had turned away from the railing entirely and was wiping his face with a handkerchief he had pulled from his breast pocket. Trevor Klein, second chair in the jazz band, was on his knees. Actually on his knees on the marble floor, both hands over his mouth, laughing and crying at the same time. Brendan Walsh, the lacrosse captain who had shoved Caleb into a locker 2 months ago, pushed through the crowd to get closer. His face was wrecked. He was clapping so hard his palms had gone red. And Harold Whitaker was not moving. The color left his face in stages. The first thing to go was the flush of anger in his cheeks. That drained out of him in the first 2 seconds of the silence, before the applause ever started. The second thing to go was the set of his jaw, the tight, controlled line of the man who was always about to win. That softened into something slack and unfamiliar. The third thing to go was the most important thing, the thing he had worn for 58 years, the certainty in his eyes that he was the most important person in any room he walked into. That left him last. It left him slowly, and when it was gone, he looked, for a moment, like a man who had walked into the wrong building. He tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He tried again. Beside him, the senior assistant dean, a woman named Laura Hastings, who had worked under him for 6 years, leaned in and spoke without moving her lips. "Harold, the parent in the red coat is still recording. It's already uploading." He did not respond. He was not there. Diane Kessler, the senator's advance coordinator, was still speaking into her cuff. Her voice had dropped to a murmur. Whatever she was saying, the voice on the other end was no longer telling her to stand by. A side door opened at the east end of the atrium. Senator Elaine Whitmore walked in. 67 years old, 2-term United States Senator from Massachusetts, daughter of Reginald Whitmore, the jazz pianist who had played the Savoy Ballroom in 1952 and had died the year she was elected to her first office. She was wearing a navy coat and low heels, and she had been standing behind the marble column at the east entrance for the last 3.5 minutes of Caleb's performance, because Diane Kessler had radioed her the moment she had understood what was happening in this room. She crossed the atrium slowly. The applause did not stop, but it quieted around her, the way sound quiets in a church when someone important walks to the altar. She stopped in front of Caleb. She did not look at Harold Whitaker. She was not going to look at Harold Whitaker for the rest of the afternoon. Caleb raised his eyes. He was still a little out of breath, and he said the line he would not know until years later was the line that changed his life. He said it to Harold Whitaker. Quiet. No venom, just true. "You told me to try, sir. I hope it was everything you dared me to be." Senator Whitmore took a breath. She spoke to the room, not to Whitaker. "Young man, would you do me the honor of opening the gala tonight?" Harold Whitaker opened his mouth. He closed it. He nodded once, stiffly, because there was nothing else left for him to do. 3 hours later, the chandeliers came on. The Jefferson Prep Founders Gala filled the grand ballroom the way it filled it every year. Black tie, champagne towers, a string quartet warming up in the corner that nobody was listening to. 600 guests, 3 news crews, the mayor of Boston at table 4, the president of Berklee College of Music at table 9, because Diane Kessler had made a phone call at 4:15 that afternoon and said, "Cancel whatever you have tonight. You need to see this boy in person." Dolores Sutton sat at the front, in the seat that had been reserved 2 hours earlier for the chairman of the board. A Jefferson Prep senior had given up her own borrowed gown so Dolores could wear it. The oxygen tank beside her chair had been draped in a length of black silk by a junior prom committee member who had decided, without asking anyone, that Caleb's grandmother would not be sitting next to a piece of hospital equipment tonight. Mrs. Brooks walked to the microphone. She had been crying on and off since 3:42 that afternoon. She cleared her throat twice before she could speak. "The young man you are about to hear," she said, "is the reason I still teach." She paused. She tried to say his name. Her voice cracked on the word family, and she stopped, and she did not try to finish the sentence. She stepped away from the microphone and put her hand over her heart and looked at Caleb in the wings, and he understood. He walked out. He played for 12 minutes. He did not play what he had played in the atrium. He played something quieter. Something for his grandmother. A melody she had hummed over a hot stove in a Roxbury kitchen for 61 years, arranged for alto saxophone by a 17-year-old boy who had sat at her feet and learned every note of it without knowing he was learning. Dolores wept through every bar. The rewards began that night and did not stop for a month. Diane Kessler walked the president of Berklee over to Caleb during the reception and introduced them by first names. The president listened to Caleb speak for 4 minutes. Then he said quietly that the audition in 6 weeks would not be necessary. A full 4-year scholarship was on the table, effective the following September, and the only thing Caleb needed to do was accept it. Caleb looked at Mrs. Brooks. She nodded. He accepted. A man named Gerald Ashford came up to Dolores during the dessert course. He was in his late 70s, silver-haired, in a tuxedo that fit the way only custom tuxedos fit. He said he had known her late husband. He said they had worked together at the MBTA bus yard in the early 1980s, before Gerald had left to start the logistics company that had eventually made him very rich. He said he had not seen Dolores in 30 years, and that he had not known, until tonight, that her grandson was the boy in the atrium video. He said her medical bills were going to disappear. All of them. He said it the way a man says something that is already done. And Dolores, who had not let herself cry during the performance, cried then. A second donor, a woman who had been sitting at table 11, whose name would not be released until a press conference the following Tuesday, announced the creation of the Sutton Scholarship at Jefferson Preparatory Academy. 5 full tuitions a year in perpetuity for scholarship track students in the arts. The Board of Trustees convened an emergency meeting 72 hours after the gala. Harold Whitaker was placed on administrative leave pending review. He resigned 8 days later in a brief statement that did not mention Caleb Sutton by name. The interim principal named to replace him, by unanimous vote, was Evelyn Brooks. The video of the atrium reached 40 million views before the end of the week. "Try, I dare you," became a phrase people used on the internet the way people use phrases that outlive their origin. A black music critic wrote a feature for The Atlantic with the headline, "The Boy in the Gold Light." In it, she wrote, "What we saw in that atrium was not a miracle. It was a young man who had already done the work, meeting the moment he had been preparing for his whole life." 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, Caleb sat on the fire escape of the 3rd-floor walk-up in Roxbury with the Selmer across his lap. The kitchen window was open. His grandmother was inside, stirring grits. She called out, "Baby?" Play the one your mama liked." He did. The applause had faded. The cameras had moved on. But most of them will never be heard. Most of them will spend their whole lives waiting for a room to go quiet long enough to listen. Most of them will not get a Diane Kessler walking through a side door at exactly the right minute. What Caleb had was not luck. What Caleb had was 3 years of 4:30 mornings. 3 years of a Selmer Alto bought with a wedding ring. 3 years of a grandmother zipping his jacket at the door and telling him his music was his ancestors talking. By the time next week, I am telling you about a janitor at a Manhattan law firm who solved a case 3 senior partners could not crack, and what happened when they finally found out who he used to be. You are not going to want to miss it, because sometimes the person you underestimate is the only person in the room who was ever going to change it. See you next week. But the real power in that atrium came from a grandmother named Dolores, who sold her wedding ring for a saxophone and told her grandson his music was his ancestors talking. That's the lesson. Dignity doesn't beg for a seat at the table. It does the work in the dark. And when the moment comes, it plays the note. And listen, I think we've all been in that atrium. Maybe not marble floors, maybe a break room, a classroom, a family dinner. Obviously smaller than their title tried to make you smaller than yours.